Hello guys, in this video I'll show you how to remove inventory and equipment components. First we need to create new interface which will replace few functions from equipment component. I will name it combat state and I will add 4 functions there. Now let's implement this interface in Combat Character Blueprint. So go to class settings and add this interface. Now we need to add new variables, is in combat and combat type. And now we can implement these functions from interface. Okay, let's go to event graph and remove interaction events. Now let's find line trace for interactable and remove it, and also interaction actor. Okay, now we can also remove UI events and equipment events. Then function use item. And let's remove from class settings interface cannot open UI. Okay, now let's open Archery events, and instead of taking arrow class from equipment, we need to set it manually. So let's select basic arrow projectile. Okay, now let's remove this graph for decrementing arrows count. And in here, let's create new variable, has arrows, and make sure to set it to true. Okay, now let's find where is in combat function from equipment component was used, and we need to replace it with new variable. Create new variable is shield equipped and replace it with function from equipment component. So let's find it. Okay, and now let's do the same for combat type. So let's just find it and replace. Okay, let's open toggle combat function And here let's replace function from equipment with function from interface. Now let's open that function, and we can remove graph enabling ragdoll on equipped items. Okay, now let's go to viewport and add static mesh, which will be our sort. So let's rename it. And also make sure to set no collision. Then let's open on collision activated function. And instead of taking sockets from equipped weapon, let's just use our new sort. Okay, now let's open input buffer events and remove all events related to equipment. Then let's find canBlock function. Okay, and we need to recreate this function in this blueprint. So let's create the same function canBlock, and we can copy and paste it from equipment component because variable names are the same. Okay, and now let's just replace it. Also make sure to mark it as pure. Okay, now let's go to event graph. And we need to create new event, set combat type, which will take combat type variable as parameter. And for now, let's just leave it like that. We will implement it later. We can also remove save game graph. Okay, now let's go to bang and play. And we need to remove initialize of equipment, and let's also remove interaction timer. Instead, let's call new function with unarmed value. Now let's go to abilities events, and we need to modify switching abilities. So instead of using index of slot in equipment, let's just use ability class. Okay, let's promote it to variable. And now we need to modify the values in input events. Okay, and instead of using equipment events, let's call new function set combat type with magic value. And let's also update ability. Okay, and we can also call set state and reset it after a short amount of time to simulate the change. And finally, we can also remove selected spell index variable. Okay, and finally, we can remove equipment and inventory components from this character. Okay, now let's go to animation blueprint of combat character. Okay, we can remove this graph, the switch, and in event graph remove everything related to equipment component. Okay, and let's store character info now directly from the character, and after we do that we can remove unnecessary variables. Now let's open ability component. Okay, in storing references, let's remove this equipment component reference. Okay, now let's remove all events related to equipment. Okay, and finally we can also remove variable. Okay, now let's open extended stat component and remove events related to loading game. Okay, now we can open stats manager component, and here let's remove everything related to equipment, so storing a variable and all the events. And we can also remove macro update block base value, and also keep in mind to remove variable. Okay, now let's open game mode, and basically we can remove everything from here, so all the events and all variables. Okay, now let's open anim notify toggle combat, and instead of using function from equipment, let's use function from interface that we created in the beginning. Okay, and let's also open basic arrow projectile, and from there we can remove update arrow mesh, and let's set mesh manually to 11 arrow, for example. Okay, now let's open animation blueprint of 11 bow, and we need to change get owning actor get owner to simply drag it pan owner. Okay, and let's also open widget in game and remove everything that will no longer be needed, so equipment, inventory, action, stats and stuff like that. Okay, now let's open base AI blueprint, and we need to implement same interface that we did for combat character. So first let's create variables is in combat, combat type and is shield equipped. Okay, and now let's implement that interface and all these functions. Okay, now let's replace isShieldEquipped function from equipment with our variable. Let's also modify onCollisionActivated function. So remove this part, and then in the function handleMesh onDev, let's remove equipment related events. So basically all of that, leaving only mesh part. Okay, and in begin play, we can remove initialization of equipment. And let's also change combat type with our variable in macro. And then we can finally remove equipment component. Now let's open example AI blueprint. Okay, and let's add in shield and sword meshes. Okay, also make sure to set no collision for both of these meshes. Okay, and now let's override event onCollisionActivated. Okay, and if type was main hand item, then let's use sockets from our new sword mesh. Okay, and if it was different type, then we can use parent implementation, but it is actually not required for this AI, but we can add it. And also in class defaults, let's change combat type to null, and let's stick isShieldEquipped variable. Okay, now let's open Mage AI, and let's add in particle system. Okay, attach it to hand socket, and we can set it to arcane hand, for example. Okay, now in event graph, let's remove this begin play part, and instead let's simply modify combat type value to magic. Okay, now let's open Archery AI, and let's add in bow skeletal mesh. Okay, let's set anim instance to elven bow and socket. Okay, now let's go and remove it from begin play. Let's modify this arrow and set it manually to basic arrow projectile. Okay, we can remove has arrows check and just replace is in combat. Let's also change get combat type from equipment to our new variable here. And do the same here. Okay, let's try to compile, and finally you can change combat type to range. Now let's open summoned AI blueprint, summoned minion, and from begin play let's remove this set combat function, and instead actually let's call interface function there with true value. Okay, now let's modify animation blueprints of AIs. So remove this part related to equipment component, and instead let's update is in combat here. Okay, and let's also remove variable of equipment component. And now let's do the same for example AI and mage AI. Okay, now let's open AI controller, and instead of updating is in combat like that, we no longer can use equipment, so instead let's just set timer. Okay, and add new event which will update is in combat directly from possessed AI. Okay, and let's set timer to looping, and time can be about 0.1. Okay, now let's update behavior services. So first let's replace functions used by equipment component with variables from character. Then in update behavior function, let's remove this promotion to variable of equipment component, and everywhere where it was used we need to replace it with interface function from the target. Okay, also make sure to remove equipment component, and now we need to do the same for example AI and mage AI. Okay, now let's open a library, and playing sounds functions we're using equipment component to get informations about the target and receiver. So now we need to change it to set the sound manually, and in the future you will probably want to modify these functions to use systems. So for now I'll just leave it like that. And let's do the same for play Paris sound and play black sound. Okay, and finally, when we removed all references to inventory and equipment components, we can remove unnecessary files, so just follow me there. Combat character, I also forgot to connect settings in combat, so just do it. And if you've done everything like I do, you should be able to attack with your character. And if we change combat type to, let's say, Mal, you should use sword animations. And let's also check range. Okay, so there is no bow, but system works fine. It's a bit slow, so we can speed it up a bit. Let's open update M alpha function, and here, instead of taking attack speed from stats component, let's check if combat type was equal to range. Okay, then let's select value of 3, let's say, and otherwise let's just use 1. Now let's test it again. Okay, so it's much faster now. Okay, now let's add rest of the items like bow, shield and particle, which will represent abilities. Okay, so I already implemented this function to not keep you there for so long, and I will explain how it works, and then you can rewrite it if needed. So firstly, it checks few conditions and then calls function update items, and this function firstly hides all items, so bow, sword, shield and particle system. And this is very simple macro. It just attaches component to mesh at given socket. Okay, and then it checks whether combat type was magic, and if not, then we can clear ability, because in magic system we are able to use abilities attached to weapons, and if you won't clear it, we will still be able to use them even if we change combat type. So let's test it. If I use fireballs and then switch to unarmed combat type, I'm still able to use fireball. And this happens because of this second ability input. So you can remove it or leave it if you want to use abilities with weapons. So for example, you could switch ability based on combat type. So for example, if we're using Mel, we can use Shockwave. Okay, and then it checks whether our character is in combat or not, and if it is, then it attaches proper items to proper slots. Okay, and then just for safety, we're calling ability events. Okay, and now let's also call this function it set is in combat. So whenever combat changes, it will be called and items will be attached to proper sockets. And finally we have these inputs, which allows us to set combat type to unarmed, Mel and range. And if we want to change to magic, then we can use this quick switch ability inputs. So let's do some final tests. And so I can use unarmed type, Mel, and ranged. So as you can see, there is no arrow in hand. I would recommend to create anim notify to use it, just like it was before in equipment component. Okay, and sparse works as well. So basically that's all I wanted to show in this video. So thanks for watching.